Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to this amazing event here at the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church. We are a welcoming community that comes together to seek truth and work for justice, nurture compassion and courage, reach out to each other and to our larger community of faithful people, bridge the divisions that wound the human family, transform ourselves and our world. And I wanted to read that this afternoon because it is such a great honor to have with us a national treasure like Reid Soskin. And what is important in these times is to have places of sanctuary like this community and who and what it is part of the great legacy of what Betty Reid has left to all of us. So at one point, this congregation had the honor of calling itself her spiritual home. And so we are very, very grateful to welcome her back. I also want to take a moment and honor the planning committee that made this event possible. If they could just rise up for a moment or raise a hand so we can say thank you to them. So that is great. We want to thank each and every one of you for navigating the perhaps spiritual challenge of parking for this event. And we are grateful to be here. It is a fitting tribute to have so many of us in this sanctuary. And with no further ado, I will turn it over to Arliss Ungar, who will introduce Betty.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Betty Reid Soskin was born in 1921 to a Cajun Creole African-American family with deep roots in Louisiana. Her great-grandmother, whom she knew well, was a slave. As a child, Betty moved to Oakland, where she grew to adulthood. She was in her early 20s during the Second World War when she worked for a black auxiliary trade union near the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond. In 1952, a young married woman with small children, she moved to the Walnut Creek area, where she and her family encountered the hostility of racism as one of the first black families in the area. This church, the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church, began in 1951 with 14 persons meeting in homes. It was incorporated in 1955. And in that year, Betty formally became a member. She was active in the church, serving on the board of trustees for several years as head of religious education, giving services on occasion, and singing in our yearly review, The Hungry You. The church supported Betty and joined in her efforts to work against discrimination in housing and for racial justice. David Bortin, for whom our social hall, Bortin Hall, was named, was her ally in the social justice work. Our first minister, Aaron Gilmartin, often called Gil, was her friend and mentor. In 1965, when Gilmartin went to Selma, Alabama for the march, it was Betty who helped fill the pulpit singing her original songs. She became aware that she personally and the church had the potential to affect the community. For 20 years, she honed her political skills in our community as a bridge between cultures and races, interpreting one side for the other. Her work for open housing and other human rights helped to set the tone for what this church has become, a place where we value all people and where we work for justice. Betty was an active participant in shaping those values, and we are very grateful. When her children left home, Betty moved to Berkeley. She took over Reid's Records on Sacramento Avenue in Berkeley, which she had helped to found, and used her position as a black store owner to further her role as a social activist for constructive change. Betty was a singer and songwriter and gives strong support for black culture and black performing arts. She has served as aide or field representative to several East Bay liberal politicians and on the board of Starr King School for the Ministry, the Unitarian Universalist Seminary in Berkeley, where she helped with their early efforts toward countering oppressions and working for sustainable community. Betty, now 96, lives in Richmond. She is on leave this month from her work as a national park ranger so she can publicize her book. Betty Reid Soskin's Betty Reid Soskin's authenticity and her deep ingrained sense of culture, place, and purpose are obvious in the way she lives her life. Please welcome Betty Reid Soskin.
Thank you. Arliss's introduction was a reminder for something I'd almost forgotten. The fact that when the Black Caucus was formed in the Unitarian Church, in this congregation where we had been working for more than a decade by then toward integration, racial integration, that was our goal. And suddenly, Aaron Gill Martin, had attended the meetings in Boston and came back with the news that the black members had walked out, that there was this caucus forming. And he brought me to his office and said, "You need to know about this, Betty. This is something you need to know about." And I wasn't sure at that point whether it was a step forward or a step back. I didn't know how I felt about it. But we decided that the caucus was forming at that point, its first meeting in Chicago, and we were trying to decide whether or not I would participate. The congregation took a vote. There was only one vote against my joining that movement. And it was because the person who voted against it was fearful that I would not come back to the church. 99% of the people not only supported me in that effort, but funded my trip to Chicago, which means that I was the only black person attending the conference, completely supported by the white congregation that I came up. That's been our lives ever since then. In trying to figure out what I would read for you, I think I'm going to go with Into the Lion's Den because it connects with this church. It'd be great to say that I was a feminist, but I didn't know what that was. Career was never anything to me. In fact, I never even attended college. I never had a break between belonging to my father, whom I respected, and belonging to my husband, Mel, who was my best friend, who I married after meeting him at the age of 13. It was a predictable marriage, and I can't say that I questioned any of that. I really was living a prescribed kind of life until we moved to Walnut Creek, and I found that I had to either choose sides racially and politically or not survive emotionally. We wanted to build a house and could afford to when the war ended. Mel's parents had moved to Danville, which was across the eastern hills from Berkeley, and had a little truck farm and raised horses out there. There weren't enough people in Danville then to resist anything. By that time, we had Rick and our son Bob, and I was pregnant with David, and on the way to have the kids ride the horses at Grandpa's house, we would pass through an area called Saranap, which was an unincorporated area between Walnut Creek and Lafayette. And Mel saw a vacant lot that he decided he wanted. It was a little over a half-acre bordered by a creek. There was no house on the property, but it had an old cement swimming pool in the middle of it. And after spending years poring over magazines like House and Garden and Sunset and Architectural Digest, we decided that this was a spot where we wanted to build our home. That was in 1952. But even though the property was in an unincorporated area, there was still no way we could buy it because we weren't white. So we got a good friend, Dorothy Wilson, who was white, to make the purchase for us. She was the wife of Lionel Wilson, who later became the first black mayor of Oakland. What I didn't know at the time was that with the end of the war, returning servicemen were using the low-interest mortgages available because of the GI Bill to move into those communities east of the Berkeley Hills, beginning the suburbs out there. And because the GI Bill was administered locally rather than federally, the local banker could determine who could get mortgages where. Which meant that those communities could be formed by white people who would be coming to the suburbs, but the black people could not follow due to strict racial restrictions. White people were trying to people like me. We couldn't even get a bank loan to buy property above Grove Street in Berkeley, outside what was prescribed as a black district, even though we were a small enterprise doing business with the Bank of America in Berkeley. The bank wouldn't handle a loan for us. So we decided if we were going to have to fight, we might as well fight for something we really wanted. So we went all the way to the suburbs in the Diablo Valley on the other side of the hills. So here we were, this young couple with 2 children and one on the way, moving into the midst of the lion's den. And we spent the next 5-10 years in the awfulness of rejection, having to sort out where we were in that whole thing, becoming the objects of ridicule and hostility. When the neighbors found out who had actually bought the property, it triggered a lot of anger. Sewell Smith, the Quaker architect who designed our home, was threatened, as were we. We got numerous threatening letters. One of them indicated the belief that Father Divine, who was at that time was the great spiritual leader of the fundamentalist movement across the country, had purchased the property to put in what was called a heaven. We got word that if we tried to stack lumber there to be used for building the house, some mysterious they would set fire to it. They never followed through on those threats. It took 6 months to build the house. And sometimes I drive out there and just sit at the property watching the construction progress from my car. And as time passed, local people would walk down, usually around sundown, to where I was sitting alone in my car on the roadside. And they'd stop long enough to identify themselves and quietly, without fanfare, welcome me to the neighborhood. Almost every one of those families had performed that ritual. The local improvement association continued to take its stand against us being there, but individually, at least, some of those people in that community who came to me and said, I hope you'll be happy here. It was a very strange thing. What they could do collectively, none could support individually, at least not openly at first. Around that time, Robert Condon, a well-known radical liberal attorney, to use a description popular at the time, lived just around the bend of Los Chances Creek, just over the bridge from our new home. He was a partner of Robert Truehalf, Condon, and his wife Eleanor. They were both heavily involved in Democratic politics, and when we first moved into the neighborhood, they offered to give us a dinner party to introduce us to the neighbors because they were absolutely enchanted by our presence. Our being the first people of color in the community gave them a chance to validate their liberal credentials. We were going to become their cause. And I remember telling them absolutely not. They were not going to give me a dinner party because that would suggest that they were giving us permission to move into a house that we had a right to build and that we had a perfect right to own. And probably because of my speaking up We never got to be friends with the liberal and colorful condoms. My refusal probably fell on their ears as an insult, and I never really knew why their enthusiasm waned, but these were my suspicions. But as we got pushed against the wall, what came out was a feisty, proud Betty, and what apparently was the birth of this woman who later became a political activist. At that time, I was fighting for my right to be in that community and feeling perfectly deserving, wanting to set an example for my children. It was really very personal. I was not a part of any movement. I was not a member of the NAACP or any other civil rights organization or any political organization, and that was, I think, the beginning of my wanting to stand on my own. I remember telling the Condons, I don't want you to feel responsible if I don't mow my lawn. I told them they couldn't give me permission to move into that community because that would also give them the power to define my life as I lived it. I think that maybe those are the road signs that track me back to a deliberate progression toward my political awareness now. The construction period spanned from early spring to around November of that year, and Rick had been transferred from second grade into Berkeley Elementary School, where he had been doing so well that there were suggestions from his teacher that we began thinking about having him skip the next grade and enter fourth grade on probation in the fall. I knew that we would be moving to Walnut Creek school system in the fall, so that had to be a consideration in just how the transition would be managed. But in the new school, Rick proved to be working at grade level. The differences in the educational levels between the inner city and suburban schools surfaced immediately. Mel and I decided that the least disruptive way to deal with the problem would be to register him at Parkmead Elementary in Walnut Creek for the fall semester while we were still living in Berkeley, and have him ride out each morning with his dad while the house was being completed. Sensible solution, right? No, disastrous as it turned out. This gentle 8-year-old was being dropped off each day into a hostile world of children who were expressing all of the venomous racism that was being freely expressed around their dinner tables each night. Ugliness that the adults in their lives were not honest enough to show publicly to us, Rick's parents. It must have been horrendous. Poor little guy never mentioned it at the time, and I was too pregnant with David and preoccupied with toddler Bobby and the house building, choosing tiles and carpeting and bathroom and kitchen fixtures to even be aware of his pain. It all seemed so logical, sans the race element. After all, when we were growing up in East Oakland, the kids on our block had overcome their feelings of discomfort with us long before their parents did, and sometimes in the late fall, I attended a parents' night at school and was asked by the principal just why I'd enrolled my child in this school when I didn't even live in the district. We moved into the new home that October, so the question held no relevance, but the principal's inability to meet my gaze suggested that his question was being asked due to pressure from other parents. Rick was the only black child in the school. We were only the second black family in the entire valley east of the Berkeley Hills at that time. We were breaking new ground reluctantly. We were developing growing defiance and a feeling of entitlement, but those feelings were not yet fully matured. There were still times when I wasn't all that sure that we were right. Sometime later, Marion Powelson, a sympathetic Jewish neighbor who had moved out to Walnut Creek from Berkeley after we did, mentioned that she picked up a flyer advertising a minstrel show fundraiser. It was going to be staged at the school. Marion and I were both horrified at the thought, but didn't have a clue about how to deal with it. The image of white people in blackface, with kinky wigs and huge white painted lips, was just too impossible to imagine in America of that day. Just one day before the big show, I drove to the school with no idea what to do, except that I knew I had to act. I walked in the principal's office and sat down to wait. He was off somewhere on the school grounds, but his costume was hanging loosely over the doorway. He was in the cast of the show, as were all the members of the faculty. His costume was black and white and had bright red polka dots with baggy pants. I could feel my chest tighten. He walked in, almost whipped around on his heels to leave at the sight of me, but turned back and continued into the room. "This is wrong," I said quietly. "Whose credit?" He answered, "I guess you're right, but I didn't know that until I saw you there." He attempted an explanation. "Our faculty loves colored people," he said. "And we're only depicting them as the happy people that they are with their songs and their jokes and stuff." My answer was, "Do I look happy?" "No," he said, misery emanating from his eyes. "Let's think this out together," says I. I explained to him that minstrel shows were originally conceived as ridicule of Negroes and was never a black thing. We can't afford this kind of tradition to follow us through history, to continue to heap insult and degradation upon a people, least of all at the hands of educators, who, above all, should know better, I told him. "What would you have me do?" asked this man, who by now was flush-faced and clearly embarrassed beyond measure. I distinctly remember feeling sorry for him at this point. It was clear that he was in a learning place and that it hurt. I told him that with tonight's dress rehearsal at hand and the show only 24 hours away, I would not ask that he cancel. I did insist, however, that a portion of that night's rehearsal time be devoted to sharing my concerns. And I also served warning that the next evening I would be attending with my friend and neighbor Bessie Gilbert to see their show. And we did just that, front row center and unashamedly tearful throughout the entire awful performance. It was a dreadful evening. Little was gained, I think. The experience was miserable for me. There was as much anger and resentment stirred by my action as there was enlightenment. I'm certain of that. I did little for my own kids, since I found it impossible to talk about most of those things. I was never sure that by doing so, I wouldn't simply further and alienate them from others. Only a few weeks later, there was an Aunt Jemima pancake feed held by the local Chamber of Commerce at a downtown civic park. That's who we were in 1952. That's who we were. We'd completed construction on our new home on the banks of Los Trancas Creek in Walnut Creek. It had by this time been about 3 years since Mel and I had moved in with our 3 little boys, years before Dorian's birth, and Mel had returned to full-time managing of our record store. Though I gained a few defenders, life was still strained and fraught with uneasy feelings of living under constant threat. I was left to spend my days pretty much alone, defending our right to exist in suburbia against the many stay-at-home wives who are now our small family's major oppressors. Their spouses, like mine, were away earning the mortgage payments in San Francisco and Oakland, and looking back, I realized it was a strange time for us all, a time remembered with pain and mixed feelings still. Our status as the only black family in an otherwise white upscale community made us vulnerable to the hostility, but it also gave us visibility to those whose sense of morality would cause some to rise up to defend our right to be among them. This set the stage for a few weeks that I now see as a beginning of my adulthood, and what would prove to be a gradual move toward full independence for me as a young parent, with an emerging sense of self-worth. Over the years, I was gradually convinced of my own power to stand alone, but up to that point, I had been sustained by my upbringing in the belief that a mere woman could not survive without the support of the men in her life. My proud father and very traditional young husband provided the power needed to survive the times, even if only in my head. I questioned not. Compliance. Thy name was Betty. Yet, for several days, I'd been reading in the local newspaper about the growing hostility at a newly built working-class development in the town of Pleasant Hill, just a few miles away from our home in Walnut Creek. The stories involved a young black couple. He was a truck driver and a pregnant wife, a nurse's aide. They'd bought one of the modest homes and were being threatened by an angry improvement association that was distributing ugly pamphlets and posting signs imploring the community to come together to prevent them from occupying their home or brave the dire consequences. It was classic, full-blown racial mayhem. It was also not unlike the resistance that our family had experienced only a few years before. Our immediate neighbors had organized in the same way, threatening to burn our lumber as it was delivered. I'd rarely been confronted openly by my neighbors, however. They were far too outwardly well-mannered for that. It had been a devastating period in our lives, but it had been lived through, and we had all learned from the lessons I would now share. It had also been a period when I was unable to speak for myself most of the time, but now I could speak out on behalf of someone else, and in the process, finally have a chance to make my own case, maybe. David Bortin, an attorney practicing in Walnut Creek and a member of a Unitarian fellowship consisting of some 25 families, had read a letter I'd sent to the editor of the local paper after reading of the plight of the young Pleasant Hill couple. He called to say that he'd agreed with my position and offered to be of help. In the course of our conversation, I mentioned that the Gregory Gardens Improvement Association had scheduled a meeting at the local school that very night and that I was thinking of attending. I'd go in order to let the community know that this change might be difficult, but that they would all survive in the end. Perhaps my experience could be of help. David was concerned that I might be hurt and warned me to think about it carefully before doing such a thing. I convinced him that while I learned how hurtful these angry and insulting words could be through hearsay, I never really heard the awful things my neighbors had hurled in my direction. Only those things were rumored or written. I remember saying to him that my color will protect me. That kind of viciousness is never expressed in the presence of colored people, only behind our backs. I will go, and they will hear me out, and then I will leave. Such innocence. David then told me that he would also be there, and that there might be others. He would make a few calls. That early evening, I dressed carefully, drove out to the school, parked in the crowded parking lot. I found my way into the auditorium and took an aisle seat about halfway up the center, attracting little notice from anyone. The meeting was called to order by the president, who presented the problem and called quickly for testimony from those gathered. It was then that the rage began to fill the room. One after another, they angrily expressed the reasons that their homes must be saved from the invasion of the undesirables. They spoke of threatened property values, etc. I felt like a spy sitting among them. I grew increasingly uncomfortable. In my home community, only a few miles away, I had become the blackest of women. And here I was invisible. They failed to pick up my difference, my own undesirability. So my imagined protection that they would not speak such words in front of a black person had failed because they didn't recognize me as a black woman at all. I was just an innocent witness to bitter racism for the first time in my life. I'd opened a new Pandora's box in my newly adopted role of defender rather than victim. at the point where a woman viciously spat out, "If we can't get the niggers out any other way, we can use the health department because of the filthy diseases they bring in." I could be still no longer. I rose from my seat, walked to the front of the room, turned to face the angry crowd, and started to speak. Identified myself, and then added, "I'm one of those undesirable niggers you're speaking of." I talked for about 10 minutes, nonstop, while the group stared in disbelief. The words threatened to dry up mid-throat. I told them of our building our house not too far away, about how that community had felt the same anger that they now did, about how we moved in under similar threats, and that I knew that members of my community who were resistant had every right under the Constitution to feel that resentment, but that same Constitution guaranteed me and my family, as well as that new black neighbor moving into Gregory Gardens, the right to house our families as we wished. Then, before a stunned audience, I walked straight down the aisle toward the main door leading out into the now menacingly dark parking lot. With the mouth bone dry and panic about to take over my body, from behind I could hear chairs scraping against the floor of the auditorium and felt feet scuffling as people began to stir. I later learned that many left the meeting at that point. A reporter wrote in his piece the next day, it was clear that many were simply there out of a wish to understand the situation and to listen to their neighbors. According to his article, those attending were of mixed opinions and not acting as one. This was the last known meeting of the Improvement Association. As I walked through the parking lot toward my car, I could hear quick footsteps rushing from behind in the dark and panicked. A stranger caught up with me just as I, by now in tears, frantically pressed the key into the door lock. He quickly assured me that he was with the press, and all he wanted was my name and phone number. "I need to get back in there to see what happened in the wake of your speech," he said, "but I'll call you later." So saying, this friendly stranger disappeared into the night. Then a strong hand on my shoulder. It was not threatening. Immediately they followed a voice saying, "It's all right. I'm David." As promised, he was there to help. By this time, I was sobbing out all of the disappointment and disillusionment that unlikely scene had provided, and the hideous rhetoric my family's presence in the community had unleashed. David had been right. I foolishly underestimated the inherent danger of the situation. But his support at a time when it mattered beyond all reason also provided the hope that I so desperately needed in order to survive and grow into the power that would sustain me over a lifetime. I found out later that after I walked out, a man had stood up before the people who were left and said that he knew me, that I was one of those kinds of people that were trained by the communists to do this kind of work. He had been one of my classmates at Castlemont years before. I had thought he was my friend, but that evening served as an introduction to the Mount Diablo Unitarian Fellowship through David acting on my behalf. This small group later evolved into a formal church that is now known as the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church. Within a few short months, I would become a member of the fellowship's board of trustees, beginning an active membership that would span the next 20 years and provide friendships that have survived the decades. A path would be set for adventures in social activism that would become the basis of my existence and the foundation of all that followed. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty.
Thank you.
It is so moving for all of us to be part of one of the many legacies you have left to us. We are going to take a few questions, and I'm going to ask all of you. We're so glad to have those of you that are guests, and I know that we have many from our community here. So maybe I'll speak mostly to them, but if it pertains to you, you can listen. Sometimes we are long-winded in our questions. This is
part of the tradition.
Exactly, yes. This is a precious opportunity to hear from Betty. Let us allow that to happen. Art has a microphone. We have 2 microphones. We will be using microphones so all may hear. Would anyone like to ask a question?
No question?
No, we're just getting the mic there. There we go.
Hi, Betty. This isn't really a question. Wow. I grew up in this church. In fact, my mother and Betty kept track of the library at the Highland Building. I'm Marcia Ford, daughter of Don and Jewel. And I just wanted to...
You gotta hold the
You can't hear me?
There you go.
Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Daughter of Don and Jewel. Anyway, I just wanted to say that Betty has been a part of our life since we moved to Concord in 1954. So, forever.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you. Thank you. There's many connections here I know we need to honor. Let's see. There you go. Carl behind you. Oh, there we go. Okay, good.
Betty, I'm just wondering where you found the strength and how you developed it, and I think we have a clue who reinforced it, but where did you find that strength in you?
You know, I don't really know. I've lived my entire life in a constant state of surprise. I'm not a planner, I'm not a list maker. I wake up every day with a clean canvas. I think that I simply met everything as it rose. It's been a grand improvisation for me.
We have someone in this row right there.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Betty. First of all, I don't know if you remember, but a bunch of us in this church you had given us a tour on your 90th birthday of Rosita River. I don't remember that or not.
Yes.
My question is that your great-grandmother lived to be 104, was born in slavery, and of course you knew her well. Did she ever discuss anything about living in slavery that you can relate?
No, I didn't even discuss slavery with my children. I learned about slavery when I was in school. That is such a deep scar that is not carried in families. I knew about my great-grandmother's slavery life by my mother's younger sisters, the stories that Vivian would tell. I knew, for instance, that she was a house slave, that she and her mother, who were owned by the same slave master, they would cook, would carry the meals out to the field slaves. She was also the midwife of the village that she lived in. It was she who would play intern to Dr. Hydell, who came through every 3 months on horseback. And her job was to go out and hang a white towel on the gatepost of where he was to be needed. And then he would come and make his rounds. He would confer with her at the end of his rounds and on aftercare of the patients, so that she held a very high position in that village. But those are not stories that came from her. Those are stories that came from my mother's younger sister. My great-grandmother only spoke a patois of French, so I wouldn't have understood what she was talking about anyway. But when I knew her, my mother's generation was still bilingual, but that was the language they gossiped in, so they didn't tell them.
Exactly.
There's someone else.
Yes.
Would you like to tell us what it was like to meet President Obama?
Oh my God. That was an experience I will never forget. I was invited, well, the Department of Interior had me go back 2 years ago to do the honors at the National Tree Lighting Ceremony and to introduce the president on PBS, that special that's made of that tree lighting. There are 2 tents behind the stage where the performances are, and in one of the tents are the entertainers. Big stuff, and they're all in there waiting. And then there's another small tent. It's only about 10 by 10, and in there are 2 flags, one the presidential flag and the flag of the United States, and between them were the president and the first lady. And I was led into that room just after the Secret Service had swept the room, and I heard one of the Secret Service men say, "That's Betty," and I realized I had been released. But when they led me into that room to meet the first lady and the president, they were both, of course, they're both over 6 feet tall, and I'm 5'3", and I felt like a child between them. But there is a magnetism. There is something about that couple that is so amazing. I felt it the minute I walked in the room, and I had the sense that I knew why he couldn't get any of his bills through, because he was so feared in Washington, because that couple so put the lie to white supremacy. I mean, I am sure that in their presence, fear would be obvious. He put out his hand and I put mine out to shake upon introduction, and in his hand he had cupped the presidential coin, which he transferred to my hand at that point. And I felt it there. But all I could say was to look at Michelle and say, "You are so beautiful." I don't think I ever said anything to the president. But one of the most memorable things, even after, well, I was holding in my hand a little silk bag, evening bag, a beaded bag, that my Aunt Emily had received from her husband on their 35th wedding anniversary. And Aunt Emily had been long dead. She was one of my great-grandmother's daughters. That bag had been given not only to Aunt Emily, but Emily had given it to my Aunt Vivian on Vivian's graduation from Xavier University. Vivian had given it to me, and I had given it to my 18-year-old granddaughter. But I had it with me that night because the kids thought it needed to go to meet the president. And in that bag, I dropped the presidential coin, and in it was the string of pearls that I had received on my wedding day from Mel, but I had also given to Susan Sanford, a member of this church, Don Sanford's daughter, when she was leaving to go to teach in a freedom school in Mississippi, in Canton, Mississippi. She wore it under her T-shirt throughout the whole summer of '64, came back and gave it back to me, and that were in that purse. The Secret Service tried to get that purse from me because you couldn't go in the president's presence with something that wasn't really, and I wouldn't give it to them. And when I was introducing the President of the United States, I was holding my speech in one hand and that little purse with the presidential coin of the first African-American president in that, and with Susan's pearls there, as I introduced the first African American president with my great-grandmother in my breast pocket.
We are only going to have time for a couple more questions. I want to ask one, which is this.
Yeah.
Betty, as you know, this is a time in our nation when we are once again deeply divided around questions of race.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what words of hope you would offer to a young person starting out today in the world as you and your husband were.
Oh, that's easy. I have lived long enough to have lost my sense of future. At 96, I don't have any more models ahead of me. I am making it up as I go along because there are no patterns for me anymore. But my sense of past has been enhanced. And it's a good thing because I'm earning my living dealing with the past. But it's also true that I know that these periods of chaos, one of which we're experiencing now, we've been experiencing since 1776. It's like we're on an upward spiral. We keep touching the same places at higher and higher levels every time. I'm not enslaved like my great-grandmother was. But it's in those times of chaos that democracy is being redefined, that we have access to the reset buttons, and that the table is being set for the next generation. And we're in one of those periods right now. All those ugly things that people of color have been going through, that I've been going through, watching Charlottesville and the Kentucky Parade, and there was nothing there that I hadn't seen before, or people like me had not experienced before. What was happening was that all of you were finally seeing it for the first time. So all of that is out there now for us to look at. All the warts, all the strange things that need to be corrected, they're accessible to us. So I feel hopeful. I really feel hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. You are just a treasure.
Thank you.
I would like to know, as we're having a lot of conversation in this church and across the country around race, what advice, what wisdom would you give to white people to stay engaged in the conversation? It's a very scary conversation for many to try to figure out and try to stay present. That's one of the most difficult things. Given your experience, what would you say to people as far as how to stay present for this conversation?
I'm not even sure. I wish I were wise enough to know how to answer that. It's very hard. It's very hard for me to know. I've never been a white person. No, you're laughing, but that's really true.
That's true.
I have a very, very specific look on life because of the life I've lived. So I'm not sure how to answer that. I am sure that there's going to be a lot of thinking that white people are going to have to do because the fear of no longer being the majority population has to be weighing heavily, because that's really true, and that's what you got to deal with. At a time when a lot of us are really becoming beige. No, let me tell you, I spoke not long ago at the David Brower Center for the People for the Global Majority. And here were 350 young people, all of various racial mixtures. And the subject was not race, it was the environment. And I thought, wow, that's where it is.
You know, Laura Ransom asked Betty what it was like to meet Barack Obama I have this feeling in my career that someone I know someday will ask me what it was like to stand up here with Betty Reid Soskin. Let's thank her for her work.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are so grateful. Let us express our appreciation. We're going to let you all come and let Betty come down here, but we want to thank again our own. As part of the legacy of your life, we continue to carry on the work of racial justice in this community. And thank you, Betty.
Thank you.
So we're going to put you down here.
Okay.
But you can wait for a minute. You don't need to.